This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 30 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Engaging Experts. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer, and today's guest is Professor Emeritus Edward Lamoureux from Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. Now, today's show is a special edition. We're going to take a look at what can go wrong in expert witness engagements and how both experts and attorneys can get on the same page at the outset. So, Professor Lamoureux, first of all, thank you so much for joining me here today on Engaging Experts.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Of course. Now, tell me about your work and how you were first contacted for your first expert witness engagement.
Well, I'm a professor. I was a professor at Bradley University. I came originally in a speech or in a comm department, speech comm, teaching, rhetoric and interpersonal communication, small group, public speaking, that kind of stuff. But I transitioned into interactive media and became kind of the concept guy for them. And in that process, co-authored a IP law book for undergraduates because we needed to teach our students in interactive media who are making media about intellectual property law, and there's no books. So I grabbed a lawyer from Chicago and an IP lawyer from Chicago and a librarian from Northwestern, and we wrote a book, 2009. So and I'm co-teaching this class, and I don't know whether the lawyers that employed me read a review of the book or found the book. At that point, I probably wouldn't have popped up on the internet as an expert about trademark, but yet I knew about it because I was teaching about it. And they were interested in sort of the unique approach that I take to analyzing language with a PhD in communication and rhetoric from the University of Oregon, and a dissertation in the used conversation analysis, the everyday analysis of speech, and then transitioning to law. No law school, self-taught, but spent maybe 3 or 4 years studying to prepare to do this class. I had kind of a different take on these issues. So I got a call, long distance, from a lawyer who was based in Michigan, who was going to do a case in Illinois. And they were getting ready for trial, and they were looking for an expert. And the case, roughly speaking, was a trademark case. It was a confusion case. They represented the senior mark, and there was a junior mark coming into the market with the same field, same kind of outfit, and a very similar name, and we're going to set up shop right across the street in many cases around the state. So they ended up in court. And he said, we think you can do an analysis that will show maybe people get confused. And I said, well, given what you've said about the case and what I know here, I think I probably can, because I kind of understand how this works. I sort of combine rhetorical criticism with conversation analysis and a little bit of brain science, because that was the sort of the early days of beginning to map how people's brains worked in terms of making metaphors work and such. I said, but you got to understand something. And at that point, I kind of stopped the conversation with him and said, look, you got to listen to me. I'm not the right guy. And
so you told him, you said you were not the right guy.
Yeah, I quite literally. I think those may have been my words.
Were you looking for expert witness engagements?
No, at that point I was not at that point I wasn't signed up. Subsequently, I sought to see how this would work, but at that point, I don't think I was on the board. I might have had an inquiry in, but I hadn't done any cases. This is a rookie experience.
Sure. So you say no.
Yeah, I said, you don't want me. And he said, why? And my explanation was, look, I combine 3 or 4 different fields, and I know that I'm describing how people work out how meaning works in everyday life. But that's a description that comes from a number of different disciplines, and it's hard for people to make that connection. And so if that gets presented to a judge or a jury, they may not understand it. Or if it gets presented to technical experts in any of those disciplines, they may not agree in what I've come up with because I'm combining stuff. So I said, what you need to do is, the University of Illinois is down the road. They got a lot of PhDs down there, and some, even some PhD graduate students in linguistics who can do a linguistic analysis of the words, and it'll be technical. And by the way, it will be wrong because that's not how people think, but it will be more acceptable to experts and perhaps to the court.
So not only did you say that you're not the right person, you tried to send him along a pathway that would work better.
I did. I didn't have a name, but I just said, you need this kind of person, and there's lots of them, but not at Bradley, not at Illinois State. You need to go to Illinois.
Okay.
At Champaign-Urbana. And I didn't have a name handy because it's not my discipline. I just know they're down there, right? So he said, oh, no. We want what you can do. He said, we want to know what people are actually thinking as they're working this, whatever, what Joe Friday's actually doing when they're drive by and they see the signs. I said, okay, I can do that. So what do I do?
So you felt that you had given him enough of a disclaimer that if he still wanted to proceed, it was on him.
Well, and on top of that, I honestly believed at the time, and I still do. I go back and look at that report once in a while. I was right. I mean, I wrote a report that it makes a credible argument as to how people can get those two marks confused.
Sure.
I would write a better paper today, but I the one I wrote was fine. So anyway.
So you didn't write anything that you
absolutely not.
Didn't agree with. You were completely honest the entire.
Absolutely. And scholarly. I mean, it was a pretty good argument. So I said, well, what do I do? He said, well, you write it up. I said, well, what do you mean you write it up? I'm a total rookie. I've never done this.
Right. What's an expert report?
Yeah. What's an expert report? He said, you've written academic papers, right? And published. Yeah, I published papers. I published books. Heck, I was a academic journal editor for 2-3-year terms. I mean, I edited stuff and, I know how to write. Mm-hmm. Okay, do that, but just keep it short. And it's not a book. It's not a published article, and then send it to us and we'll mark it up. Okay. So I hung up from him and I called my co-author and co-teacher, who was an IP lawyer in Chicago, and told him roughly the story and said, can you send the sample? And it happened at the time. He didn't have one, but he said, I've seen your writing. We've written together. Write it up. Okay. So I didn't have a sample. So that's a touch point for anybody who takes one of these things and hasn't done it before. Get a really good sample. But anyway,
did you ask for a template, a sample, or anything like that?
So I sent the report. They marked it up, sent it back, but it didn't mark it up much. I mean, a few things. I've made the changes and submitted it. There was a deadline that I was told we have to have it by X date, whatever it was.
Was it a tight deadline from the time of engagement? No,
Not
you had
really.
Plenty of time.
No, I
didn't feel rushed.
No, not at all.
Okay.
So, but I didn't know what the deadline was, and that's going to come up later in the story.
All right.
I don't know. Well, I guess I'll preface it by saying I don't know who had the deadline. So I met the deadline they gave me. Okay. So the next thing that happens is we're going to go. It continues. Nobody settles. So we're going to go do a deposition of me with regard to my testimony as submitted in my report. Never done that either. Word to the wise on this. If you've never done this before, you should probably get coached. In fact, I would recommend that you have a dummy session, a practice session with a very aggressive adversarial lawyer type who's going to show you what this might be like. Because I was totally unprepared. I got in my nice looking outfit and I drove down the street to 45 minutes to Illinois State where they wanted to meet. And I went in the room and the opposing lawyer proceeded to spend 45 minutes tearing me new body holes. I mean, it was just, I was totally unprepared for it. Now my history is pretty good. I've never committed a crime. Other than traffic tickets, I'm a pretty straight guy. But by the time we got done, he brought up stuff I'd forgotten. And I had no idea we were going to do that for 45 minutes. Okay?
Well, we have to dig into that. What is it like getting in a contentious, difficult deposition without preparation? And what are the things that you would do now if you had to do it over again to prepare?
Well, I mean, in the first case, I guess among lawyers, it's common knowledge that the first part of that deposition is going to go into the history of the potential witness.
Right.
But I didn't know that. And so just knowing that would help a little bit. I tried real hard to not be defensive, but this guy's asking me questions that quite literally, again, I didn't remember the answer to some of them. When did I do this? Or, was there problems with doing something else? And these were all work related, but I tend to speak up a lot, so I can get in trouble now and then. And, and he seemed to know everything about me, and that's fine. I can defend myself, but I was unprepared for the level of confrontation of it. Right. So it just threw me off because I wasn't prepared. I didn't know that this was coming. Mm-hmm. And it was also enervating. This was 45 minutes of grilling, which I didn't expect the tone of it. He was nice enough, but it was grilling. Now, if we'd gotten through deposition and I'd gotten to trial and been on the stand, if in front of judge or jury, the witness gets attacked, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Witness credibility, I get it. But in the deposition, I expected to just explain my report.
Right.
And that's not what happened.
Right.
So, so we get done with that, 45 minutes of that. And then he kind of brings my report over, and he didn't look at it very much. And he starts to ask me about essentially the sort of the concepts around my report and kind of, a little bit about what I'd written. And I'm watching and listening, and we're sitting at a desk, and he's a nice young man, and I'm probably 20 years older. And I know what the education is of most lawyers, and no disrespect, just I know what they've studied. And all of a sudden, this guy's kind of a technical expert at all of the stuff that I've written at a level that I'm baffled. What? So we did this for about 2.5 hours and going through the report, and he sounded, like a advanced PhD student at the least in all of the stuff that I had written. But because I had a few years on him and I wrote the stuff, I didn't have any problems. We went back and forth, and the lawyer who engaged me at lunch, when we got to lunch, said, "You did fine." I thought I did. So we get done with the back and forth on my report, and he gets up. We're going to go to lunch. And just before he hits the door, he turns around, he throws a folder down on the desk and says, "Here's our expert report." And my lawyer goes, "Huh?" And I look at him and kind of do the same thing. So the end, kind of the implication of that, the fact, I had submitted mine in a deadline. I don't know. I assume their expert, submitted his at the same deadline, but we sent mine to them in discovery, and they didn't send theirs to us.
Well, it may have been a rebuttal report written specifically after yours. It sounds like that's what happened.
Okay. But, was this something that we needed to prepare for in a different sort of way than we'd prepared for it? Because it was devastating, and had I had any inclination about what he was going to do, I didn't even know that at that point. I wasn't even sure they'd employed an expert, by the way. At that point, we didn't even know that they had one. I had asked my lawyer before, or the lawyer that engaged me before we went to Illinois State. I said, do they have a lawyer? I'm sorry, do they have an expert? And I got repeatedly told, we don't know yet. So now everything the lawyer asked me now comes into crystal clarity. He has used this report by his expert, which I'll talk about in just a minute, as sort of the launching pad for asking me questions about my testimony.
Right.
And I'm helpless, other than, I can answer him, but I'm helpless. I got no defense in terms of what the lawyer or their expert said. So then what we find out when we look at that report over lunch, and I'm having trouble getting anything in at all from the shock, is they went out and found the exact guy type of person that I had recommended. They went to an Ivy League school. They got a senior member of the faculty, retired emeritus, who had done, I'm going to say 30 trademark cases exactly like this one, had done the same linguistic technical analysis that I said would probably be appropriate, and first tore my report to shreds and then wrote his linguistic analysis, and that was his report. And without sounding overly self-congratulatory, it's the same thing I said at the very beginning that I told the lawyer. He was wrong. I was way closer to right in terms of the way everyday people think. But you can produce a linguistic analysis that says, here's what the linguistic science says is going on in people's brains. Here's how we believe in linguistics. By the technical rules of linguistics, we can say, here's how meaning works. There's some stuff in there that works, but a lot of it is just for those guys. It's not how people think. Right? People use different ways of thinking, which is what I wrote about. So anyway, we went back in after that, and the fun was really over. We just went over stuff again. As you know, you can't. You do get an edited version of the. I'm sorry, you get the transcript back from the deposition, and you get a chance to edit, but you can't make any substantive changes. So I went in and I did. I called both lawyers, the guy who employed me and my colleague, and said, how much of this can I shape, given that now I know what they're up to. And they said, well, you got to be awful careful, not very much. So I made a few changes and tried to shape it a little bit. And not long thereafter, we heard that I wouldn't need to go to trial because I'd been released by a Dauber challenge, and the judge had determined that I was not expert enough. Okay, so I got some money from this, and a little experience, and I think, well, it's going to be a while before I get to do another one of these. And then maybe 6 months later or so, I don't know if it was quite that long because it's still 2009. I'm on the internet looking at, sort of my reputation, because I try to keep the thing pretty clean, and there's not much bad stuff out there about me, and very little. And I come across this article by a blogger who's a JD and does analyses of cases. And this is an analysis of a trademark case in which there are experts, expert witnesses, and expert reports, and there was no survey, no word survey,
Right.
and relying just on the experts. And why I was daubered out. And I wrote to her and I said, look, here's what happened. This was the lawyer. This wasn't me. And she hid behind 230, which, we're not going to have that conversation right now, but there are reasons why not being able to force people to take stuff down is problematic. But she wouldn't take it down, so I'm stuck with it. And I really thought, well, that's it. I'm toast. So that's the story.
What? A couple things. One, were there any red flags that you feel in retrospect should have alerted you to be like, oh man, I really need to bug out early. This is just, I shouldn't be on this at all, or things that you could have done differently? Were there any red flags that you feel that you might have missed?
Well, no, not that I missed, but that I knew weren't good enough. I mean, there were indications, and I knew that it wasn't up to speed. I mean, first of all, I was not able to ascertain what the difficulties might be from an out-of-state lawyer. I think it is problematic for a new person, literally, absolute rookie, first case, to not have a template to write to. I think you got to have at least 2 samples, one good one and one bad one. I mean, when I teach writing to students in college, every assignment's got 2 samples, one good one, one bad one. I don't tell them what they have to write or how they have to write. I give them samples. This one was an A, this one wasn't. Okay. I got no help. I think you absolutely, and how would you know? Common sense, yes, but on the other hand, if the engaging lawyer says no, that's just write it up, and in this case, even my colleague friend says, you've written stuff, it's been published, you've written articles, you've written books, just write it. But if I'd have seen the report, if I'd have seen a linguistically based report like the expert they got had written, I'd have changed my style.
Did this entire experience have an impact on you professionally after that, or even personally? Was this difficult to get through, or was it a, hey, these things happen, how is it to get through these things? And I ask because newer expert witnesses might experience this.
Sure.
What is the worst case scenario? What is it like to have to go through after the case is done? How do you move on from that?
Well, I think the hardest part for me is that there's no recourse.
Mm.
I mean, when you're a lifetime academic, I was almost 50 years in higher education. There's a lot of rejection notices. The way we write, we're going to write maybe 3 or 4 or 5 that are going to rejected as we work down the decision tree to somebody who'll finally take it. Now, I got a
Sure.
stack of rejections this high. I'm not impervious to rejections, but I respond really pretty constructively to rejections. But my problem with this one, and there's no way to advocate for this. You asked, and I'm telling you.
Please.
I very much would have liked to have had a venue to contact the judge, to the court, because I think the court needed to know that they released an expert, not based on what the expert did, but based on what the lawyers did. And not being able to give the judge that feedback, or the court, or the process, I don't know quite how to put that, but not being able to put that feedback leaves the thing like an open wound. There's just there's no fixing it. And for me, I just assumed that I'm no longer available. Now, I make money in other ways in my life, so I wasn't desperate for it, but I assumed that I'm pretty much out. Now, that might be an inaccurate assumption, depending on the subdiscipline that somebody asked me about.
Sure.
But this is a game for, I don't know, game is the wrong term. This is an activity for people who have experience in the activity, and the only way you can get it is to be successful a couple times and continue to be successful. And I think there's a whole bunch of people maybe who aren't successful. Now, maybe not for the reasons I'm not, but what are they supposed to do, right? How are they supposed to repair that reputational issue? And I felt additionally, quite literally, you could look for as long as you want to look. Your listeners could look if they want to. You won't find anything negative about me on the internet, except because I was a hard teacher. Every once in a while, the students gave me a, not great rating on rateyourprofessor.com. But as long as you stay off rateyourprofessor.com, I'm not angelic. I'm not the second coming, but I have an excellent reputation, except for that one blog.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to teach the students all the time about the pros and cons of 230. And there's a lot of cons on Section 230. There's a lot of places where innocent people get damaged, and they can't really do enough under the law to fix that damage. That's a whole nother conversation, but it's, that's problematic.
Before we wrap up, do you have any last advice for expert witnesses, newer expert witnesses in their first engagements, or even attorneys who are working with inexperienced expert witnesses?
Well, we've talked about kind of the touch points about providing aids and stuff. I guess, so here's the thing. At what point do you say, I need the money, but I don't need it that bad? And that's an individual line, But I guess what I would say is, man or woman, if you're thinking about whether you need the money that bad, maybe you don't. I mean, it's I think we know in life, well, no, it depends on your philosophy. Some of us think in our lives that if money is the only motivation, maybe we shouldn't be doing it. And so I would at least give it a second thought. If you're really pressed, and it's really more than anything else, the availability of the funding, that's probably not a good enough reason to do it. But the other thing is, I was clear that I was not the right guy. I didn't try to slide in saying, oh, well, maybe I can get this done, even though I told the guy, I said, I'm the wrong guy. And I explained why. And he insisted. So if the attorney's going to insist that I'm the right guy, I guess I'm going to have to be willing to take the shot if it ends up, damaging me. Then it was just bad lawyering. And I don't think you can tell a rookie how to watch for bad lawyering, because there's too many things that a lawyer can do too many things wrong, just as they can do a lot of things right. So that's kind of a tough one. You're going to jump in and, you buy your ticket, you take your chances. But I would speak up. I mean, the only thing is I did. And in my case, it wasn't enough, but I probably should have spoken up more. No, I'm not writing this report until I get a sample.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that,
Dr. Lamoureux, thank you so much for joining me here today and sharing your story with us.
Thanks for asking. It's always a pleasure to talk with folks who are interested in life stories. It's kind of what I was in rhetoric and communication. Life stories are kind of my thing. So yeah, it's great. I appreciate the opportunity.
Of course, and thank you as always to our listeners for joining us for this special edition of Engaging Experts. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Engaging Experts. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com.